Delighted to have with me David Hawkins for some reverse crime scene investigation. David, thank you so much for accommodating my travel schedule. I know this is substantially later than you and I are usually doing broadcasts, but when you called me earlier today, you were sharing some really interesting information about some new people, specifically one gentleman, a knight of the British Empire, if I'm not mistaken. What can you tell us about what you've assembled for us to discuss today?
Well, as usual, you do these brilliant collages, which is the opening blast of our show today. And on the top left, you've got a Field Marshal Charles Guthrie, who's a
Yep.
Scot from the landed gentry. And why I've missed this guy, and I'm sure he's a remarkable, brave, courageous individual. He served with the SAS, which is the elite, well, I don't know if they're specifically counter-terrorism, but these are the forces in the United Kingdom that operate behind enemy front lines. And of course, one hopes that the enemy they operate behind doesn't include the United States. Now, this guy, Charles Guthrie, he spent a long career with the British military, and he was commander of the British Intelligence Corps, which is a pretty influential position, prior to his retirement after many years of service in 2001, which, as you know, for Americans and for everyone around the world, was a very interesting year because a lot of things happened in 2001, including, I believe, an attempt to overthrow the government of the United States by force, but I'll come to that in a minute. So I think he resigned or retired from the British military in June of 2001. And then, lo and behold, and if you look at the Wikipedia entry for N.M. Rothschild and Sons, they only have one highly powerful and influential name in their list of alumni, if you will. Obviously, members of the Rothschild family, but then various political and banking leaders, but only one military guy, and that is Field Marshal Charles Guthrie. Now, there's a
Yeah.
problem here for Americans, actually for the free world and the Five Eyes countries, because on the 47th floor of the North Tower on 911, there was a meeting of shareholders addressed by Christopher Hyman, who had come
Right.
down from a breakfast meeting on the windows of the World Restaurant. I would estimate he left the breakfast meeting and he left everyone behind him to fry. Repeat, to fry. And this was the Risk Waters Group breakfast meeting. They had about 16 people from the Risk Waters Group, which I think is a publishing organization for the world of insurance and risk, and about 72 high-grade guests at that breakfast meeting from companies like JP Morgan and so on and so on. Anyway, he goes down to the 47th floor to address a meeting of shareholders of SERCO. And as I keep repeating, the shareholders of SERCO are extraordinary because this was a management buyout of a company called RCAGB 1929 in 1988, and then, no, 1987, and then it was an IPO, excuse me, on the stock exchange, London Stock Exchange, masterminded, I believe, by N.M. Rothschild. So I think it's reasonable for us to assume, given the level of spoliation of evidence on the 911 crime scenes, to make an aggressive inference of guilt that the people who hosted that shareholders meeting for SERCO was Wilbur Ross, 25 years with N.M. Rothschild, and quite possibly Field Marshal Charles Guthrie. And the question I believe one day you'll be able to ask, if we can get any of these characters on your show, is what the hell were you doing on the morning of 911, right? Because we know that Wilbur Ross might try and batch your questions because you ask him very difficult questions that he doesn't want to answer.
That's right.
Isn't that a test of, maybe you should just comment on what you asked him and why you asked him?
Well, I'm sure our regular viewers will recall it was just 2 or 3 weeks ago that I had chance to meet Wilbur Ross at the Turning Point USA conference in Palm Beach, Florida. And I wanted to ask him specifically about SERCO's involvement with the Patent Office, because he was giving a speech that day, David, about the 10 millionth patent that had been issued by the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. And you know, he's a very skilled negotiator. Obviously, the man commands multiple millions of dollars and has negotiated deals all the time. I would imagine he's quite practiced at concealing any discomfort he may have at a question or being put on the spot. But I think if people go back and take a look at that brief interview, they'll see that he sort of looks around and says, I'm here to talk about space. He did not want to discuss SERCO at all, and he seems quite connected. I would have asked him about his involvement in N.M. Rothschild and Sons and what he was doing on 9/11, but I was pretty much shuffled out of there. They told me he had a call and he didn't want to answer my questions. But the other thing I want to remind our viewers about, David, is that you and I have taken to doing a show each Wednesday here on YouTube and Periscope, Facebook, VK.com, DLive, Twitch, Patreon, of course, and we've got our generous sponsors on Patreon.com. People can go to David's page by going to Patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards, and I hope that people will sponsor David. I couldn't do this show without him, and there is no advertising revenue that comes from doing these shows. Everything on Crowdsource The Truth is community sponsored. So I hope that people will go to patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and support David financially. You can also sponsor the show by going to patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. And to be clear, David's funds are David's, and Crowdsource the Truth funds are mine. I've specifically avoided commingling or paying people to come on the show or having employees or anything like that. I think this is the best way for the audience to decide which of my guests and myself to be compensated and how much. And David, you had pointed out to me that it's best for us to operate from the assumption with regard to Patreon and the deplatforming of certain people, that they want to do the right thing, but they're being influenced by outside forces. And this is a common theme in a lot of the things that you talk about, these influence operations. We see it happening to the American people. President Trump made a speech about border security just last night, and we've got Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi trying to influence everyone's thoughts, saying that what Donald Trump is saying is not true. I disagree with them, but this is a tactic that goes way, way back, and deception is one of the keys to it. So if I understand the hypothesis correctly, Charles Guthrie, Sir Charles Guthrie, the British general that you're telling us about, actually was able to take control of the U.S. military on 9/11, is that right?
Well, he had the opportunity to take control, because if you go back to your master collage that for the introduction of the show, I'll just cover the high points of it that make me think that Guthrie had this potential. So what you put in the foreground is the famous Federal Bridge Certification Authority.
Yes.
And down at the bottom left, you've got the UK MOD.
Yes.
No, correction. All right, let's just look at the UK MOD. So the United Kingdom Ministry of Defence, right? And obviously Charles Guthrie would have had a key role at the most strategic level with the UK Ministry of Defence. Over on the left, you've got this phrase CCEB, UK CCEB. That is Central Communications Electronic Board, which links the Five Eyes countries, and it has the root key. So whoever is in the UK MOD, or is the senior player in the UK MOD, actually has the root key for any interaction between the various parties on the Federal Bridge Certification Authority, which would include the four major defense contractors that played obviously a pivotal role in 9/11. And one of the things that I would like to do if I were, for example, Donald Trump or the FBI director, is to call in the chief executives and senior people of those four defense contractors and say, well, for example, with Boeing, what the hell do you think you're doing when your aircraft are hijacked by barely skilled pilots and flown with great precision into strategic targets, Are you the subject of a man in the middle attack, or does any of your technologies have backdoors that might allow someone like General Guthrie to take over in the middle of an exercise? And the answer, of course, is Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon. All of their equipment had been backdoored through the Federal Bridge to the United Kingdom Ministry of Defense.
This back door is a really, I've heard about it quite a bit. I was just in Philadelphia last night speaking with Michael Moore, and he told me that when he had developed, this is, of course, Michael Moore, formerly known as Thomas Paine, the editor of True Pundit, he had developed a technology for spoofing cell phone numbers, meaning he could program in any phone number and then call someone, and the caller ID would show a false number, and this could be used by intelligence services, etc. Michael told us that he was called to a meeting with a trade group that consisted of representatives from the DEA, the FBI, the CIA, etc. And they basically informed him that he needed to create a back door so that they could access this software. And it wasn't a negotiation so much as an instruction. It's very interesting, David. It seems like almost everything has been compromised and penetrated. Do you think we'll get to discussing Palantir in this conversation? Is that a technology that you're familiar with?
Well, I'm not particularly familiar with, but I am interested in its clients, because Palantir has amongst its clients the FBI and the CIA, and amazingly enough, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. But let me just get back to this, the big picture of your collage, right? If you could shrink it down again.
Sure.
So what you've done is you've superimposed the schematic of the Federal Bridge with all of these fascinating links. And it was you who brought this particular incarnation of the Federal Bridge to my attention, because the one that precedes it has some very interesting companies, including two banks, which would be Citibank and Wells Fargo. Now, Wells Fargo was the master server of the leverage lease on the Twin Towers, which represented $3.4 billion, of which Larry Silverstein put in some chump change at about 20 million. And the rest were a cartel of banks, if you will, who had a $3.4 billion dollar interest in the Twin Towers when the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey sold the 99-year mortgage or lease on that building in around June of 2001. Now, what does the Wells Fargo people do? It looks like they double the insurance, which is always very suspicious when you come to buildings that subsequently collapse either through fire or explosions, because maybe it's just, although just is too small a word for the attempted overthrow of the American government on 9/11. Maybe it was just an insurance fraud, because they stood a chance of doubling their money. Now, one of Charles Guthrie's jobs, General Charles Guthrie's jobs, is an advisor to Aon Corp, which is the world's largest terrorist risk insurance broker. And that's kind of interesting, because Aon Corp was on the top of the North-South Tower, and they lost 176 people, which comes back to my point that I don't believe this was a generalized attack on the North, South, and South Towers. They were after specific organizations, both corporate and governmental, in order to induce fear and terror and panic within the members of that organization, so subsequently soften them up to a major fraud. Now, for example, we are aware that Aon Corporation, that lost 176 people at the top of the South Tower, their headquarters were in Chicago. They're now in London.
Is this a Japanese company, David? I'm seeing Aon
no,
Holdings.
Aon, AON Corporation.
AON.
It's a very old established insurance broker.
Got it.
Right? One of the biggest. And if, for example, you wanted to intimidate Aon Corporation into folding its tent, if you will, and moving to what was the financial headquarters of the world trading system prior to New York sort of taking it over in the 20th century, but is now undisputedly, or if that's the right word, it is again the center of the financial transactions along these global communications networks. We're back in London.
David, do
Actually,
you
we're
see
almost,
this swirl symbol here?
yeah.
I think that viewers who are aware of human trafficking and have followed Pizzagate will find that of some significance.
Yeah, now where did that come from?
Well, this swirl is a symbol that's been identified by the FBI as something that indicates human trafficking. And again, it could be a coincidence that it appears here, but I don't know.
Well, I don't think there are any coincidences. And again, Palantir has amongst its clients uh, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and you're going to need to have those assets available to you, like the children,
Hmm.
if you're going to move adults into pedophile traps and subsequently blackmail them. But
Hmm.
back to the big picture, if you
Yes.
could. Um, so you've got superimposed on the all red line. So in the background and down, you can see the text, the all red line world, which is basically, that's it, the all red line around the world. And I'd seen this map, but I didn't realize that that was the terminology of it, right? Now, the all red line, I think we can safely say, was financed by N.M. Rothschild and Sons Limited,
Well, David, let's
right?
take a step back and explain to our viewers what is the all red line.
Okay, these are the submarine or subsea cables that were installed by the British, basically to communicate in real time around the empire with the old colonies, well, of the Commonwealth. Yeah, there's a good example. And incidentally, notice that in Canada, on the west coast, you've got the cables running through Vancouver. That is
Hmm.
to say, Vancouver was a vital hub in global communications. And I think this map of the all red line is pre-World War One.
Wow.
So you can see prior to World War One, right, there were some key connections around the world, right, that linked up all of the various colonies. And one of the first things they did when uh, Germany declared war, or basically World War One started, was cut the cables, the equivalent cables that Germany had. And Germany, of course, being a landlocked country, never had an empire anything like the British Empire. And you could argue that this British Empire, it started, or it took off, or it accelerated with the launch of the British East India Company in 1601.
Hmm.
So for 400 years, the British have been doing some remarkable things around the world, right? Bringing in principle, you're innocent till you're proven guilty, and your home is your castle, and so on. But they also hosted one, Karl Marx, right? And the
Hmm.
Communist Manifesto. He worked in the reading room of the British Museum, I believe. And, he had various things that he had going for him, including abolish marriage. Even the most radicals flare up at this infamous suggestion of the communists. And that's 1848, right? So
Wow.
you've
It's
got,
an
with
amazing
this British
thing.
Empire, go
Sorry,
ahead.
David. It's amazing to think that they had the technical sophistication to create this cable network prior to World War One. I mean, that's substantial distances
Oh,
being
well,
covered.
you can go back even earlier, because the first submarine cable to be laid, they say it failed. I'm not at all sure when these failures are actually announced, whether they actually take place, because from your enemy's point of view, if they think your communications have failed, they're going to drop their guard, right?
Right.
So I think that claim that the Telstar satellite system had failed because I think it ran through the Van Allen belt. Um, I think it was actually used in the assassination of JFK, but I'm getting off. Anyway, the first submarine cable to be laid between Ireland and Newfoundland was 1858, right? The first fiber optic cable, which I think is the eighth transatlantic telephone cable, was laid in 1988, which is very interesting. And the three companies that implemented that link, the first fiber optic link, was British Telecom and French Telecom and AT&T. And as I mentioned before, the show, AT&T has a long-standing law firm that's taken care of its corporate affairs for many years, I think back to the 19th century. And that law firm is Sidley Austin. And Sidley Austin hired one Bernardine Dawn, the leader of the weather underground terrorist organization who should have been on death row many, many decades ago. And she and Bill Ayers bombed the Pentagon in 1972.
Yeah.
Right now,
Yeah.
and she's the woman who has a seminar on torture paradigms and practice at Northwestern University, and she mentored Michelle Obama and Barack Obama at Sidley Austin. Right now, when a woman like that mentors you, and I think she invented the three-finger fork salute, which I think was used by the Black Panthers to indicate the pleasure that these perverts have when someone plunged a fork into Sharon Tate's pregnant belly,
That's
you know, the
crazy.
Charlie Manson crew. So this is a really, really dirty woman, right, who's now a celebrity in the West, I think, amongst the left, etc. But anyway, going back to the technology, it is a remarkable achievement. The fiber optic technology is even more remarkable achievement. And almost all of these technologies were invented by the British, and they are ringed to this day in a patent thicket, right? Which means you can only get into that patent thicket and effectively utilize these technology if you're on the inside and not on the outside. And to get on the inside of this system, I believe you have to cut a deal with the folks, for example, at DOJ Pride, right? Now, I don't know if you remember, I mentioned this fascinating organization called the Aryan Brotherhood.
Yes.
That has between 20 and 25,000 members. And it's basically a prison-based criminal gang that operates the economics of the prison system, courtesy, I think, of Christine Marcy, Field McConnell's sister, which includes inmate prostitution. Now, inmate prostitution by the Aryan Brotherhood presumably has to be accepted by DOJ Pride, because DOJ Pride, well, DOJ Pride has this technology for prisoner tracking, right, invented by Jerome Lemelson, which uses AI, expert system, or artificial intelligence, fuzzy logic algorithms to track prisoners and provide them with privileges based on whether they're doing what they're told, right? Now, I presume DOJ Pride has in mind a different set of privileges to what you might think the Department of Justice should have in terms of distributing privileges. And I think there, amongst the privileges you could distribute to the Aryan Brotherhood is the privilege to operate an inmate prostitution racket, or, when they're parolees, to operate a pedophile entrapment and blackmail racket when they get out of jail, which is what I think was happening at Toynbee Hall in the United Kingdom in the 19th century, and Hull House in Chicago, until Field McConnell and I alerted the authorities, I guess, because after about 125 years following Jane Addams' return from Toynbee Hall, where she was in 1888, which was the year of the Whitechapel murders, she came back with her lesbian girlfriend, Ellen Starr, and founded in 1889, I think it was, Hull House in Chicago, where a lot of very young children, very often the children of immigrant families that were really, really poor, I think were groomed by these women and what have you, and potentially very vulnerable to being used for in pedophile entrapment and extortion and blackmail of the elite of Chicago.
David, this is all very relevant to what President Trump was saying in his address of the nation just last night. You know, he's talking, of course, about security at the border wall, but maybe a lot of people don't realize this. The president signed earlier today. I don't know if you're going to be able to hear this. Let me see if we can play this just so people can hear it, because I think not that many people are aware. He signed a, I think it was an executive order, but it's got to do with everything that you're talking about right now, stopping human trafficking. Let's give a listen for a moment. Let me see if I can get the volume on there for everybody.
I think that something will happen, I hope. Otherwise, we'll go about it.
So he was upset that Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer refused to fund the wall. Let's just listen for a moment.
And we're having some very good times in our country. We're doing very well, except for the border. The border is a big problem. It's a very dangerous problem. And so I can talk all about the job numbers and how well we're doing on the economy.
People should look for this video. It's titled President Trump Participates in Signing Ceremony for Anti-Human Trafficking Legislation. This was just earlier today at the White House. So that's interesting that you're now talking about Hull House. Sorry, please carry on.
Yeah, now, so again, going back to that, the initial collage that you have for the show, what we've got now is the Federal Bridge schematic of the late 20th century, at the beginning in recent years, superimposed on the red line, or the all red line, where the first transatlantic cable was laid in 1858, and the first fiber optic cable was laid in 1988, which was a very interesting year because that was the year that Field McConnell's sister, who I believe is responsible for a major wave of bureaucratic trafficking in the United States, right? But that's by the by. In December of 1988, she calls her brother and asks her brother, Phil McConnell, how she could handle a prisoner mutiny on her Conair, the full name being United States Justice Prisoner and Alien Transportation System. And he told her, you drone the plane. Now, he didn't invent droning, right? And droning, if you've ever flown a model airplane when you were a kid, Jason, using radio control to maneuver model planes is as old as the hills, right?
Right.
So the British were very good at it, and they used it in the Second World War to deploy planes to intercept aircraft, the Luftwaffe bombing, and basically degrade the German Air Force, and ultimately to launch the bombing raids over Dresden. But again, it's so easy to digress. Just going back to this superposition of the all red line with the Federal Bridge, what you have there is a real-time command and control system to die for, pun intended, or die with. Because what General or Field Marshal Guthrie could have done on 9/11, he could have been, conceivably, at the SERCO meeting of shareholders on the 47th floor, with Wilbur Ross, to coordinate the attack of 9/11. Because Wilbur Ross, with N.M. Rothschild, and General Guthrie, with N.M. Rothschild, financed, for example, the first fiber optic link called TAT, because the three parties that built the TAT connection, TAT8 connection, was AT&T and British Telecom and France Telecom, and British Telecom's investment banker was N.M. Rothschild. So N.M. Rothschild is the investment banker for US President Donald Trump, Queen Elizabeth II, SERCO, Kinetic, the company that is probably trawling around the internet intercepting your emails or your communications to see if you should be banished or filtered out or sued for, some kind of trumped up charge by a guy like Swigert, right?
Yeah.
And now, of course, but that gives them a huge opportunity to hammer the truth or degrade the truth.
Right.
We're all saying but promote the propaganda.
That's been happening all over the place, David. We saw that last night with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. Right after the president's speech, Donald Trump basically sat in his office, and I think people who watch this channel know that I generally like Donald Trump. I voted for President Trump. I think he's not very good at delivering lines off of a teleprompter. He seems very uncomfortable and stiff. But that being said, he sat in his office and he delivered a very concise, to-the-point speech where he said we need a border wall because human trafficking, narcotics trafficking, and illegal immigration have become a national emergency. And the response from the Democratic leaders in our government is that Donald Trump is making this up. I don't think he's making it up. I think it's pretty well known that those things are, in fact, happening. And we've got the Democrats on the other side of this discussion saying they want to open the borders and let everybody in. That seems kind of crazy to me.
Well, you're right, but you see, the problem for Donald Trump, and I come back to this again and again, he has 18 intelligence agencies giving him advice, right? It is not possible that those 18 intelligence agencies all give him the correct advice. It's not possible for him to distinguish between who's spinning him and who's trying to help him, right? It's also not possible, given what's sitting on his desk, and we've covered this before, the Alcatel-Lucent phone on his desk is not the terminal normally associated with with what is known as the Defense Red Switch Network. Now, the Defense Red Switch Network, the last time I've seen a photograph of it on the President of the United States desk was in the era of one Barack Hussein Obama, probably should be better known as Barry Sfotoro. But on the Barry Sfotoro desk, right, there is one image where he's actually using the IST-2 terminal with those red dots in them, where one is FO and the other is O and the other is I, and then the fourth is P. And FO stands for flash override, O for override, I for immediate, and P for priority. And what the President of the United States should have been able to do back in 9/11, irrespective of where he was, George Bush obviously being in the school where he'd been positioned out of the way, because as a fighter pilot, he would have recognized immediately the fraud in the war games that were going on, where the enemy forces had been using friend or foe switching, I believe organized through the Jerome Lemelson pattern, to get closer to targets in the United States, including, if that fourth plane had left on time, the Capitol building. So actually what's happened is Trump believes that I think that the war is the key to stopping, SWAT teams, Con Air SWAT teams, or drugs, I don't think they're coming across the wall. I think they're being flown in and laundered, if you will, through the National Visa Center, which is operated by SERCO. I mean, the American government is so porous, right? It should turn itself into a sponge.
Well, it's been compromised, of course, by some of the things that you've told us about, and it's fascinating.
British intelligence.
Right.
Right? So going back to the all red line and the Federal Bridge and the fiber optic links, what I called, well, no, correction, I didn't call it. Many months ago, I found this reference to the General Instrument Room of the Post Office in London, right? As the imperial brain. So my friend in the UK and I, we've been looking at how the imperial brain might absorb new technology. And obviously, to stay imperial, it's got to absorb new technology. So when Marconi developed or just demonstrated his wireless telegraph system at Toynbee Hall, right, which was the precursor to Hull House in Chicago, immediately, I believe the British intelligence people, they adopted it, ran a ring around of patents, so they could control that Marconi technology. And then they started to introduce in parallel wireless telegraphy and cable telegraphy. Yeah, I think that looks like, I don't know, that may be Dublin, but anyway, that's obviously staffed by a lot of people. I think it was young women. And these people were transcribing telexes or telegram signals coming in, and then they would be handed off to young boys who would run through the streets of London or Dublin and deliver the telegraph message to the house, the recipient. Now, this is very interesting, because I think at Toynbee Hall, they were grooming young women and young boys to operate the telegraph system and provide intelligence of the messages that were flowing from around the empire. Now, I don't know if you've heard of the Cleveland Street raid, but that was in the 1880s, and it was the raid on a child brothel in London, where many wealthy aristocrats would go, and they would have access to young boys, some of whom were telegraph boys. Right? So the telegraph boys would pick up the telegraph. I think maybe you can see that there. There's a young lad picking up a tape, and he's going to run through the streets of London and take it to the home, let's say, of a Rothschild or a big, you can see the young girls, or what about they're probably pretty young, and the young boys with their uniforms. And this was a huge operation if you want to gather intelligence about or from or for the imperial brain that included a specific component that I think was distributing sexual favors in return for intelligence.
So, David, this is a picture of the pneumatic tube room. And I can remember, even not necessarily that long ago, at banks and places like that, they would have these pneumatic tubes where they would send messages and documents through these tubes. Now, I don't want to distract, but you did mention young Barry Sortero, and before we get off of that, I wanted to make sure that you had received a message I sent you earlier. When I was outside the courthouse with Michael Barden, I noticed this bizarre street sign here, right outside on the streets of downtown Phoenix, Arizona, outside the courthouse. What do you make of this image on the right?
Yeah, that's very intriguing, because isn't there a medallion around the neck of Barry Soetoro
Yes.
where he's with his family in Jakarta? Now, you probably remember that the nanny that he was given by Ann Dunham, his communist mother, right, was a cross-dressing male prostitute called Turdy, unfortunate name for a cross-dressing male prostitute. But anyway, she brought this lad up, and apparently she used to apply lipstick to him.
Whoa.
And yeah, there it is. Isn't that somewhat similar to what you just showed me?
Well, that's exactly why I photographed it on the street yesterday and wanted to share it with you. It certainly looks remarkably similar. And I don't know what that symbol means, but here we see it outside a courthouse on a street lamp.
Now, have you ever played that game where you see subtle differences in images, and there's 10 subtle differences?
Yes.
Do you notice the difference between the right-hand figure and the one around the medallion around Barry's neck? What I want to say here is, this is an example of what we're doing, which is live online discovery, which comes back to my point, Jason, that you and maybe there are other people around the world, but we can show an injured community or provide an injured community an online discovery service that would help them, in principle, bring a class action suit for wrongful death in the billions against the people who have custody of these patents. So do you see the slight difference between the medallion around his neck and the one on the lamp pole?
I see several differences, but I also see similarities.
Okay, well, the difference I see for the one around his neck is, and the lamp pole has a penis.
Exactly, I noticed that. It also has fingers, whereas this is a simplified version of a similar looking thing, but it's in a sort of a, is this a Mendenhall position, David?
Well, I don't know about that, but just so backing up, I think we can now confidently say that the British intelligence with the Rothschilds understood that if you could set up a debtor's prison or any kind of prison where people could buy favors from the guards, including providing them with access to their children as sexual favors, and then you run that model into the United States through someone like Christine Marcy, which is Phil McConnell's sister, who I guess probably had about 1 million prisoners pass through the hands of the people who fly the Conair package or service. You got the potential. These people are totally under your control. You can operate drugs. Christine Marcy apparently introduced the Prisoner Medical Services Program. You could take these people who probably are desperate for sexual privileges. I believe the Cray twins were able to influence their guards in the UK such that one of the Cray twins could have a 14-year-old boy stay in his cell overnight. I mean, it's beyond disgusting. But the point is, to be honest, most people don't really want to know too much about what goes in prison. However, the people in the prison want to know exactly what's going on outside the prison and where they can, have a certain level of entertainment, either by being paroled or furloughed from prison, or basically when they've served their time, what they can do out there in the world to earn a buck or two. So this woman, I think she's an incredibly powerful. I think she played Phil McConnell like a violin. Anyway, back to now. My post for this week talked about specifically the crash of Air France 447 in the Atlantic, the disappearance of MH Flight 370, which was a Boeing 777 extended range aircraft, which was flying allegedly, according to Inmarsat, towards Australia for 6 hours, undetected by the Australian Defence Forces. Right? And then MH17, which allegedly was shot down in East Ukraine near contested territory in a place called Donetsk, right? Now, I don't know the exact routes of the fiber optic links, but what intrigues me is the possibility that Rothschild and the SERCO shareholders have access to a submarine communication system, very high bandwidth, where they are about 10 steps ahead of, let's say, the American military on 911, where we know the United States Air Force was sent in the wrong direction out into the Atlantic and away from the crime sites where, in Field McConnell's word, they would have been able to eyeball what happened over Washington. Had they been over Washington, I think Field and I assessed probably what happened. There was a little convoy of aircraft. There was the main civilian aircraft, which was a Boeing, 757 or something like that. In its radar shadow would have been a Raytheon A3 Sky Warrior carrying an air-to-ground bunker buster missile made or patented by Lockheed Martin. And somewhere in the vicinity would be what's called a spotter plane, which was probably provided by Canada from Bombardier. Now, these planes, I think the proper term is they would have been electronically tethered. Once they'd linked up, they would have been electronically flown in the radar shadow at a fixed distance behind the larger plane that, from air traffic control point of view, would have made the missile-carrying aircraft invisible because it would have been masked by the big civilian plane. And the little on-scene commander would have been the one that probably was linked up to the Maxar Technologies people to assess how much carbon dioxide would be saved by killing, let's say, 343 firefighters in New York or 125 people in the Pentagon's US Navy Command Center. Now, I don't know if you've watched that video of the E-4B aircraft, the Doomsday plane over Washington. But it's got that characteristic bulge. These are command and control aircraft in the event of a nuclear war. I think Boeing made about 80 of them. All right. And they would have been in key positions during the war game exercises called Global Guardian. They would have been generating real-time images of, there it is, that Doomsday plane, Mystery 911. I don't know if we can hear him. He's talking about a
unfortunately, David, with this remote setup, you're not able to hear the videos.
Tonight, Chief National Correspondent John King has new details about this great 9/11
So are you doing that, or shall I continue?
Today, 6 years after 9/11, the mystery endures about just what happened in the skies over the White House that terrible day. A plane flew right over it. But why? And what was it? For conspiracy theorists, the image is a gold mine. Go back to that morning. Suddenly, an orderly evacuation of the White House turned hectic. In New York, the Twin Towers had collapsed. There was word of an explosion.
Well, David, they just said for conspiracy theorists it was a gold mine, but yet we haven't heard, I never heard about this. Or, I mean, now that I hear about it again, I do believe I heard something. You can see the bulge on it.
Correct.
I didn't really hear about it until you started telling me about it. And how can they just dismiss this as, you see, that's what they do. The second there's something they don't want to talk about, they just say, oh, well, this is, this is fine if you're a conspiracy theorist, but this is, they say that and it paints the thing in a negative light, like, don't pay attention to this or something like that.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons that gets me really mad. I'm an engineer, a professional engineer, although I'm not allowed to practice because I didn't take any exams in Canada. But I've worked all over the world in really some quite challenging jobs, including helping to put out oil fires and coordinator of artificial intelligence for Schlumberger, et cetera, et cetera. And I come here, I witness, what the TV images are of 911, and I look at it and I say to myself, whether I consciously or unconsciously, hey, I got to get to the bottom of this because there's a whole bunch of anomalies. And to be dismissed as, oh, you're just a conspiracy theory, it drives me nuts. one of the things on my bucket list is to basically get the university or the faculty community to dump political science as a faculty, because politics is not a science, it's a method of manipulating people, and introduce forensic economics, the kind that I practice, so we can bootstrap the population. And there's lots of young people who read, I don't know, Sherlock Holmes or study Sherlock Holmes. And the beauty of what you and I are doing, just like with that medallion, that image, is an online discovery. So people can join this show. And what I'd like to see is we pick about 10 target injured communities, injured on 911 in the New York area, including Aon Corporation, which lost 176 people, the Fire Department of York, which lost 343 people. I believe the New York Police Department lost 60 people. Cantor Fitzgerald lost 658. Then obviously there's the people on the aircraft. Now, I think what's happened is these people are so beaten up, they've been bribed to keep their mouth shut, or they're intimidated, or they don't understand the forces behind this incredible run since 1858 of the imperial brain, and we can expose it. Over to you.
Right. Well, David, I just wanted to remind everyone that while you mentioned the injured communities, et cetera, that they can support you by going to patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards, and it's very important that people become sponsors of the show. It's the only way that we can keep the show going. They can also sponsor Crowdsource the Truth by going to, well, where's my mouse here? It seems to be lost. They can go to patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. It's extremely important that people who enjoy this program become sponsors, because we really don't have any advertising. Crowdsource the Truth 2 on YouTube is monetized, but almost every single video that we do, I get the message from YouTube that it's not suitable for advertisers. I'm not quite sure how they decide that, David, but it's all right with me. I don't really want advertisers. I want to create and produce videos for viewers that like the information that we're giving. And if anyone ever hears anything that we say that is incorrect, people are invited to communicate with us. We've got a lot of people in the chat right now, David, and I know you have a ton of things you want to share with us. I don't mean to have my ADD spill over onto you, but there's so many things coming at me constantly. I wanted to ask briefly, and there's a lot of people asking me about this, have you heard about or looked into at all the latest internet phenomenon, which is the Dark Overlord?
No, I haven't.
So the Dark Overlord is an anonymous internet entity, ostensibly a hacker or a group of hackers that has, and this feeds into what you're saying with all the insurance stuff. I believe the way this goes is the Dark Overlord has hacked or otherwise obtained documents from legal cases pertaining to lawsuits having to do with the insurance and various matters on 9/11, and they are basically demanding money in the form of Bitcoin to release different tranches of this information. Now, I have no way of verifying if this is authentic or not, but a lot of people have been talking about how mainstream media does not want to talk about Building 7 or the E4B above the White House. I mean, these are not incidental events. The utter collapse of the Solomon Brothers building? And
Solomon Smith Barney.
Smith Barney, yeah. The utter collapse of that building and the flight of a very unique Boeing aircraft over the White House doesn't seem inconsequential. So we've got this Dark Overlord. Look at this. It's a limited liability corporation, unless they're joking. That's quite interesting. But they want people to send them Bitcoin. Now, I don't know if the Dark Overlord is an entity to be trusted. It's been basically kicked off of every single internet platform you can think of. There are so far 2 layers. They've got multiple layers, and as you go up the layers, the demand for Bitcoin goes higher and higher. They were kicked off of Twitter. They were kicked off of 4chan, they were kicked off of Reddit, and then they were on Steemit, and somehow they got kicked off of Steemit. And this is interesting, David, because Steemit is this blockchain-driven, cryptocurrency-backed social media network that I've investigated quite a bit and have been talking about for over a year. My personal feelings, based on the information that I've seen, is that Steemit is an utter scam. And in fact, the removal of the Dark Overlord from Steemit just further proves that it is not a platform to be trusted, because as I understand it, the premise of Steemit was that you cannot erase things from it. However, if the Dark Overlord is releasing 9/11 documents on Steemit and then they get kicked off and those documents are removed, perhaps I am misunderstanding what has occurred, and someone in the chat room or via email can contact me at truth@crowdsourcethetruth.org if I've got this wrong. But in the event that someone has removed the Dark Overlord's information from Steemit.com, well, that's just further evidence that Steemit is a total scam. In addition to being possibly a Ponzi scheme and potentially a place where unscrupulous people can launder money through cryptocurrency, it now no longer even lives up to its own advertised qualities in that material can be removed. I don't really know what busy.org is, but that is where these Dark Overlord documents are currently being hosted. And Drew Kirk is telling us that Steem is a scam. I agree. I'm seeing so much information from so many different sources that tell us that Steemit.com is a scam. So I don't know if the Dark Overlord's information is good or bad, but it's an interesting point, and it's got to do with 9/11. This release, David, is being called the 9/11 Papers.
Right. Now, what I think we need to look for, and it's a very hard thing to prove, is the limited hangout. There are so many of these kinds of things that are introduced to us,
yes,
and it distracts a lot of people from the real inquiry. Let me ask you to just, if you can, look up Maxar Technologies' Digital Globe, completes continent-wide mapping mission for PSMA in Australia. This is an incredible surveillance that they're using artificial intelligence, machine learning, and crowdsourcing.
Continent-wide?
Sorry? Continent-wide, yeah. And they've now run a surveillance on every home in Australia, right? Let me just see. Well, buildings. And there's 15,243,669 buildings. They've run a survey and using artificial intelligence, they've counted the number of buildings with swimming pools.
Wow.
And apparently there's 1,279,438.
Why do they care about that?
Well, I'll explain, right? From the communist point of view, if you've got a house with a swimming pool, you're wealthy, therefore you're a target, right? Now, here's interesting. There are 1,251,083 buildings with solar panels. I can guarantee you, Jason, they've done the same thing in the United States, Maxar Technologies. Now, when you have those fires in California, I think those are targeted fires using monolithic microwave integrated chips made by Nanowave in Ontario, right? I think in Ottawa, that have been integrated by Maxar Technologies. And Maxar Technologies, formerly McDonald Detweiler, is essentially a systems integrator. Doesn't invent anything or very little. It just puts everything together. My thesis is that Maxar Technologies integrated the all red line with the Federal Bridge and the fiber optics links to give people like N.M. Rothschild, such as Wilbur Ross and Field Marshal General Guthrie, real-time communications with communities that are targeted for destruction. So they had the opportunity, they had the weapon, and the AI algorithms will be assessing in real time how much carbon by weight is to be saved by bringing a building down, like building number 7, or a home in California.
Well, I think
and that is the carrot or the bait for these criminal groups that are being flown around by the likes of Christine Marcy, where the alibi is, of course, you've got a plane that's moving prisoners, including quite possibly members of the Aryan Brotherhood, right, into Israel, right, to kill some Jews, and then come back and they're stacked away in a jail, maybe in a different country. So what they've done is, through this all red line and the federal bridge, which, if you notice, has got the Department of Justice on it, Veterans Affairs, and the state of Illinois, they've created a deep state prisoner community where there are people there desperate to have a 48-hour furlough to go and make a snuff film somewhere, either a mass casualty event or a high-value target event.
Right.
Right? And they're paid in carbon credits, which I would think are almost untraceable, because the carbon credit can be presented at some future time and converted into cash.
And it's remarkably similar, David, to the mechanism described by Manuel Chavez in a Discord chat message, whereby Steam dollars can be transferred to Litecoin. Litecoin can be shifted to another cryptocurrency exchange and converted to Bitcoin, and then converted to dollars. And actually, this discussion brings me back to someone that we were talking about earlier, namely I guess he's the founder of Palantir, and that's Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel is heavily invested in cryptocurrency. I believe he has investments in many of the major cryptocurrency exchanges. And Palantir is an artificial intelligence system for law enforcement agencies utilized by the FBI. Robin Gritz has told me that she was trained in Palantir. The NYPD quite famously canceled their contract with Palantir because they discovered that Palantir had a back door. And basically, there was a lot of reporting here. Let me see which is the most appropriate. Well, so here's something from the New York Daily News Wire, which is, I guess, the webpage for the New York Daily News, but it's talking about Palantir is the company that knows too much, David. My understanding is that the NYPD, which is the largest law enforcement agency in the world, dumped Palantir, Peter Thiel's Palantir, because...
Could I just hop in there?
Sure.
Now, I heard there's some kind of article about NYPD detectives being in tears because they'd seen a video with Huma Abedin and Hillary Clinton abusing a minor girl, right? Mm-hmm. Now, perhaps you can find a reference to that. Now, maybe one of the reasons why NYPD has dumped Palantir is because one of Palantir's clients is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Well, if you run a white slave traffic, or you want to stop it, and that's what I think President Trump should give you a call, because I think we're making the kind of progress he needs. That is to say, if you're going to drain the swamp, you got to know where the plug is. And I'm saying the plug is NM Rothschild and Sons, and its client SERCO and Kinetic and British Telecom. Right? And the problem is, if you've got a network of pedophile traffickers that can arrange a person of influence, male or female, maybe to meet with a young child on Little St. John's Island or Little St. James Island run by Epstein, where there's a dentist chair in the bathroom, right? And you collect them all of the material, the incriminating material, you own those people for the rest of their lives.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, it's very interesting, David. I saw another article from just the other day showing a fire on Little St. James Island. And I found it strange because we had heard that same story not long ago. And it stuck in my mind because it was the second time I felt like I was in a fake news time warp. Because was there a second fire, just in the middle of this island that they were reporting again? Because it reminded me very much of when Charles Ortel and I were having a conversation with a member of the Council on Foreign Relations by the name of Tom Lipscomb, in which I told him some information that I had observed in my investigation of the death of Peter Smith. And he poo-pooed it, and then the following day, the Gateway pundit and Jack Prosobic put out news articles about the death of Peter Smith that were just basically verbatim for the news that had come out a year ago about the death of Peter Smith. They weren't reporting anything new. They were just re-reporting the same news, kind of really trying to reinforce that false information, I think, about the death of Peter Smith. It's a strange phenomenon, and the same sort of thing happened with this fire on Little St. James Island. So David, just back to Palantir for a moment. I don't really have anything backing up that NYPD crying story, but this piece from Breitbart talks about how Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, said that the NYPD was ready to make arrests. This is from 2016. I'm not sure if they're talking about Anthony Weiner or other people, but they received huge pushback from the Justice Department. The NYPD wanted to do a press conference announcing the warrants and the additional arrests they were making in the Anthony Weiner investigation, but received huge pushback. So now we've got President Trump receiving huge pushback on the notion of wanting to have stronger security at our national border, an area that is notoriously susceptible to illegal trafficking of humans, narcotics, and other things. Seems like a sensible, logical thing for anybody to want, security at the border. And it seems like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer don't even want to talk about it at all. How is that any kind of political negotiation, to just not discuss it at all? It doesn't make much sense to me, David.
Well, I think the most strategic threat in terms of visas being issued to potential criminals to come in and attack the United States, again, it's back to SERCO's control of the National Visa Center. I mean, who in the American government decided to outsource the National Visa Center, the United States Patent and Trademark Office, 62 FAA contract towers, and the United States Defense Ammunition Center, and the back office for Obamacare to SERCO? I mean, basically, what's left in the government of the United States? And then on the desk of President Trump, where is the IST-2 terminal for the defense Red Switch network, right? Yeah. Which would allow him to communicate for example, to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, was Mattis the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or
he was the National Security Advisor, I believe.
Okay, but his replacement is an ex-Boeing executive, right? Correct. Well, I would ask, what the hell was Boeing doing on 911 when 4 of its planes were taken by these low-time pilots who could barely fly Cessnas horizontally, put through these extraordinary maneuvers, right, including I think if I can remember Field McConnell's description, a tight pivoted descending turn of 270 degrees. This is the weapons platform above the Pentagon, descending from 7,000 feet to 15 feet elevation in less than 3 minutes, and at 500 miles an hour, flying across the Pentagon lawn and taking out the Pentagon's U.S. Navy Command Center by punching a hole through 8 walls of the Pentagon into the inner courtyard to create a debris pile, I estimate, of about 1.5 tons. Well, that ain't no Boeing civilian passenger plane, Jason.
Yeah. You know, David, I was just Googling around to find an article to support the SERCO controlling the Visa Center, and there's so much weird stuff that comes up when we look at it. You know, I'm in a little bit of an awkward, like the way I have my equipment set up right here, because this is everywhere I go whenever I travel. It's always an ad hoc, impromptu setup. But we've come to the end of our hour here, David, and there's always so much more for us to discuss. People can follow our shows every Friday. We're usually coming on around 1 p.m. Eastern, but it does vary sometimes. It's really important that people go to patreon.com/reverse-CSI-storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsource-the-truth. Fridays, we always have an exclusive show that's available only to our Patreon sponsors. It's really important that people become sponsors, and if you are a sponsor, please share the links with friends that you think will be interested. We really want to grow this network. We know that a lot of people are unhappy with Patreon, and David brought it to my attention that it's very possible that Patreon wants to do the right thing with regard to the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment and all that stuff, but there may be someone influencing them. David has opened my eyes to the power of some of these influence networks and the lengths that they will go to. Patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards is David's page, and you can provide some financial support and sponsorship to David by going there and becoming a monthly sponsor. You can also go to patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth and sponsor Crowdsource the Truth. David, I'm going to wrap it up right now. Is there anything else you wanted to say in closing?
Yeah, just very briefly, for me, it's wonderful to have the financial support, but what I'd like to see is if we get clusters, I might describe them as fans, grouped around an injured community that could start communicating amongst themselves and serving up or finding us a lead. So, for example, I'm quite sure there's a firefighter or a firefighter's family in New York who know exactly what happened when those buildings came down, including building number 7. I would like them to, come on to Crowdsource the Truth or the Patreon, my site. Sure. And whether they choose to put some dollars in, I don't know. But I do know that I would love to have a cluster of informed people who belong to a community that was injured for a specific criminal event, and then you and I can enter into this fascinating discovery process, like popping up that image of the medallion around a young Barry Soetoro's neck, and it correlates with the image on that lamppost. What does it mean? Well, join Patreon and our site, and let's find out.
Yeah, hopefully we can figure that out. It's like anything, David. When you first hear a foreign language, you don't really understand what it means, but you start to make these connections, and sooner or later they make sense. What's going to happen, I believe, David, is that someone will see this video and they'll say, well, I know what that means, or I've seen that symbol elsewhere, and they'll start to contribute to the show in a way that will help us all understand this better. I have no idea what this means or what this is, but the moment I saw it, I had to photograph it because it reminded me of that medallion around Barry Soetoro's neck. And certainly, David, for people who are watching and want to help the show and support the show, but for whatever reason don't want to join patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards or patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, one thing you could do is you can copy the link to this video and email it to 2 or 3 friends who you think might be interested. If everyone watching did that, we'd have a lot of people being exposed to these videos, and certainly that would help grow our viewership and help us find the answers to some of these questions. David, I want to thank you so much for joining me tonight. I look forward to our conversation on Friday. It's always fascinating, and I'm learning so much from this.
Okay, thank you very much, Jason. A pleasure to be with you.
And thanks, everyone, for watching. Have a great night. I'll see you tomorrow.